The sun had set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple before fading into a deep navy blue. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional hum of a distant car breaking the calm. Margaret, a 76-year-old woman with silver hair tied neatly in a bun, walked slowly along the sidewalk. Her faithful companion, Max, trotted beside her, his tail wagging lazily as he sniffed the cool evening air. To anyone passing by, they looked like an ordinary pair, an elderly woman enjoying her nightly stroll with her dog. But looks can be deceiving. Margaret's life wasn't always this peaceful. She had faced hardships, raised a family, and weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. Now, in her golden years, she cherished these simple moments of solitude. Walking with Max gave her a sense of freedom and connection to the world around her. He wasn't just a pet. He was her confidant, her protector, and her friend. What most people didn't know about Max, however, made him far more extraordinary than they could imagine. Max was no ordinary dog. Before coming into Margaret's life, he had served in the U.S. Army as a highly trained military canine. His days were once filled with danger and duty, detecting explosives, patrolling hostile areas, and protecting soldiers. After suffering an injury during his service, Max was honorably discharged and given a chance at a quieter life. That's when Margaret found him through a program that connected veterans with retired military dogs. From the moment she brought him home, their bond was unbreakable. Though Max had left the battlefield behind, his instincts remained razor-sharp, lying dormant beneath his gentle exterior. On this particular evening, the air felt heavier than usual, though Margaret couldn't quite put her finger on why. As they turned onto a less-traveled path near the park, the streetlights cast long, flickering shadows. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly behind them. At first, Margaret thought it might be another neighbor out for a walk, but something about the rhythm of the steps made her uneasy. She glanced over her shoulder, but saw nothing except the dark outline of trees swaying in the breeze. Max seemed to notice too. His ears perked up, and his body tensed slightly. He stayed close to Margaret, his eyes scanning the area with an intensity that betrayed his calm demeanor. Margaret patted his head reassuringly, whispering, "It's okay, boy." Still, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something didn't feel right. Suddenly, two figures emerged from the shadows, moving quickly toward them. Their faces were obscured, but their intentions were clear. One of them called out gruffly, demanding Margaret's purse. Her heart raced as fear gripped her chest. For a moment, she froze, unsure of what to do. But then she felt a surge of movement beside her. Max stepped forward, positioning himself between Margaret and the strangers. His once relaxed posture transformed instantly, muscles coiled and ready to strike. A low growl rumbled from his throat, sending a chill down Margaret's spine, and likely the spines of the attackers too. What happened next would change everything, not just for Margaret and Max, but for everyone who heard their story. The two men stepped closer, their figures looming large in the dim light of the street lamp. One of them, taller and broader than the other, reached out a hand toward Margaret, his voice sharp and demanding. "Give me your bag," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The second man hovered nearby, glancing around nervously as if expecting someone to intervene. But there was no one else in sight, just the three of them and Max. Margaret clutched her purse tightly against her chest, her knuckles white with tension. Her mind raced, trying to think of what to do. She had always considered herself strong-willed, but fear now gripped her like an icy vice. Before she could respond, Max let out a deep, menacing growl that seemed to reverberate through the stillness of the night. It wasn't the playful bark of a household pet. It was the sound of warning, primal and authoritative. Both men froze for a moment, startled by the sudden intensity radiating from the dog. "Just a mutt," the taller man muttered under his breath, though his confidence wavered slightly. He waved a dismissive hand at Max, as if daring him to make a move. The second man laughed nervously, clearly uneasy about the situation. "Yeah, it's just a dog. Let's get this over with," he said, urging his partner to act quickly. But Max didn't back down. Instead, he took a step forward, planting himself firmly between Margaret and the attackers. His body language spoke volumes. He was no ordinary companion. Every muscle in his sleek frame was taut, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. His piercing eyes locked onto the taller man, unblinking and filled with purpose. It was almost as if Max was sizing up his opponents, calculating their every movement before deciding how to respond. The taller man hesitated, then lunged suddenly toward Margaret, attempting to grab her purse. In an instant, Max reacted. With lightning speed, he darted forward, snapping his powerful jaws mere inches from the man's outstretched arm. The attacker yanked his hand back with a startled yelp, stumbling backward in shock. "What the hell?" he exclaimed, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Max's ferocity. The second man tried to intervene, swinging a leg in an attempt to kick Max away. But Max was too quick. He sidestepped the clumsy attack effortlessly, his movements fluid and precise. There was no panic in his actions, only control. Years of military training had honed his instincts, teaching him when to strike and when to hold back. To the attackers, it must have felt like facing off against something far greater than a simple guard dog. Margaret watched in awe, her fear giving way to admiration for her loyal companion. Though her heart still pounded wildly, she found strength in Max's unwavering protection. She knew he wouldn't let anything happen to her, not on his watch. Summoning what courage she could muster, she shouted loudly, hoping to draw attention from nearby houses. "Help! Someone help us!" Her voice carried through the quiet neighborhood, echoing off the walls of nearby homes. Lights began to flicker on in windows as curious neighbors peered outside to see what the commotion was about. Sensing they were losing control of the situation, the attackers exchanged panicked glances. They hadn't anticipated such resistance from a single elderly woman and her dog. One of them pulled a knife from his pocket, brandishing it in a desperate attempt to regain dominance. "Back off or I'll use this," he threatened, waving the blade erratically. But even as he spoke, his hands trembled, betraying his fear. Max didn't flinch. Instead, he crouched low, his teeth bared in a silent promise of retaliation. The message was clear: come any closer and you'll regret it. For the first time, the attackers realized they were dealing with something far beyond their expectations. This wasn't just some casual evening stroll gone wrong. It was a battle of wills, and Max was proving to be a force to be reckoned with. The tension in the air was palpable as Max stood his ground, every inch of his body radiating authority. The attackers, now visibly rattled, fumbled for a way to regain control of the situation. One of them clutched the knife tightly, its glint catching the faint light of the street lamp, while the other shifted nervously from foot to foot, glancing around as if searching for an escape route. But Max wasn't about to let them slip away, not when Margaret's safety was at stake. Max moved with precision, circling the two men in a slow, deliberate arc. His movements weren't random. They were calculated, almost choreographed. Every step he took cut off another potential path for the attackers to flee. It was as though he had mapped out the entire scene in his mind, anticipating their next moves before they even made them. To anyone watching, it would have been clear that this wasn't the behavior of an ordinary dog. It was the work of a highly trained professional. The man with the knife tried to wave it menacingly, hoping to scare Max into submission. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain of fear. But Max didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, his ears pinned back and his teeth bared in a silent warning. His growl deepened, reverberating through the night like a low rumble of thunder. The sound sent shivers down the attackers' spines, making it abundantly clear that Max wasn't bluffing. He meant business. The second man, clearly more skittish than his partner, began to edge backward, trying to create distance between himself and the formidable canine. But Max anticipated the move. In one swift motion, He pivoted and lunged forward, cutting off the man's retreat. The attacker stumbled, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to get away. "This dog's crazy," he cried, panic creeping into his voice. Margaret watched in stunned silence, her heart pounding but her fear slowly giving way to amazement. She had always known Max was special, but seeing him in action like this was something else entirely. His focus was absolute, his loyalty unwavering. He wasn't just protecting her, he was defending her with the same dedication he had once shown on the battlefield. For a brief moment, she felt a surge of pride, knowing that this incredible animal had chosen her as his companion. The taller man, frustrated and growing increasingly desperate, decided to take a risk. With a sudden burst of aggression, he lunged toward Margaret again, hoping to grab her purse before Max could intervene. But Max was faster. Before the man could even get close, Max sprang into action, snapping his powerful jaws within inches of the attacker's wrist. The man yelped in pain and surprise, dropping the knife as he recoiled. It clattered loudly against the pavement, skittering out of reach. Realization dawned on the attackers' faces. They were outmatched. This wasn't some casual pet defending its owner. This was a highly skilled warrior who wouldn't hesitate to protect Margaret at all costs. Their bravado crumbled completely, replaced by sheer terror. They exchanged frantic looks, silently communicating their shared desire to escape. But Max wasn't done yet. He positioned himself squarely between Margaret and the two men, his stance unyielding. His eyes never left theirs, locking onto each man with an intensity that seemed almost human. It was as if he was daring them to make another move, to test his limits one last time. The message was unmistakable. "You won't get past me." As the distant wail of approaching sirens filled the air, the attackers' desperation reached its peak. One of them glanced toward the sound, realizing their window of opportunity was closing fast. The other muttered something under his breath, too low for Margaret to hear, but Max's sharp ears caught it. His growl intensified, a final warning not to try anything foolish. For Margaret, the realization hit her like a wave. Max wasn't just a retired military dog. He was a hero, and tonight, he had proven beyond any doubt that his instincts and training were as sharp as ever. As the attackers scrambled to figure out their next move, Margaret knew one thing for certain. No matter what happened next, she was safe, because Max was there, standing between her and danger, ready to do whatever it took to keep her that way. The sound of sirens grew louder, slicing through the tense silence like a blade. The attackers, now visibly panicking, exchanged frantic glances. They knew their time was running out. One of them, the taller man who had been wielding the knife, decided to make a break for it. With a sudden burst of energy, he turned and sprinted down the street, his heavy footsteps echoing against the pavement. But Max wasn't about to let him get away that easily. Without hesitation, Max sprang into action. His powerful legs propelled him forward with incredible speed, closing the gap between him and the fleeing man in seconds. Just as the attacker thought he might escape, Max launched himself into a tackle, sending the man sprawling to the ground with a thud. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and he lay there gasping, too stunned to move. Max stood over him, his teeth bared and his growl low and menacing, ensuring the man stayed exactly where he was. Meanwhile, the second attacker, realizing his partner had been neutralized, dropped to his knees and raised his hands in surrender. "I give up. Don't let the dog come near me," he pleaded, his voice trembling with fear. He looked around wildly, searching for some kind of reprieve, but there was none. Max's piercing gaze locked onto him, daring him to try anything foolish. The man froze, too terrified to even breathe loudly. Margaret, though still shaken, found her voice again. She shouted toward the approaching police cars, waving her arms to guide them toward the scene. Neighbors who had heard the commotion earlier began pouring out of their homes, drawn by the flashing red and blue lights. Some stood at a safe distance, watching in awe as Max kept both attackers pinned down. Others called out words of encouragement to Margaret, praising her brave dog for his heroic actions. When the police officers arrived, they quickly assessed the situation. Two uniformed officers approached cautiously, their flashlights illuminating the scene. One of them knelt beside the man Max had tackled, while the other addressed the one on his knees. "Stay down," the officer commanded sternly, cuffing the first man before turning to the second. Both attackers offered no resistance, their earlier bravado completely shattered. Another officer walked over to Margaret, concern etched on his face. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked gently, his eyes darting between her and Max. Margaret nodded, clutching her purse tightly. "I'm fine, thanks to my dog," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She gestured toward Max, who remained vigilant, his body poised and ready to act if needed. He did all the work. The officer studied Max carefully, noting the way he carried himself with an air of authority. "This isn't your average pet, is he?" the officer remarked, clearly impressed. Margaret shook her head. "No, he's not. He's a retired military canine. Served in Afghanistan before I adopted him." The officer raised his eyebrows in surprise, finally understanding why Max had handled the situation with such precision and confidence. As the attackers were loaded into separate police cars, neighbors gathered around Margaret and Max, offering hugs, pats on the back, and endless praise. "That dog saved your life," one woman exclaimed, tears glistening in her eyes. Another neighbor snapped photos with her phone, intending to share the story online. Word spread quickly, and soon the entire neighborhood buzzed with excitement over the elderly woman and her extraordinary companion. Margaret knelt beside Max, wrapping her arms around his neck in a tight embrace. "You're my hero," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Max responded by licking her hand affectionately, his tail wagging ever so slightly, a rare moment of softness from the otherwise stoic protector. Despite the chaos of the past few minutes, Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had always known Max was special, but tonight, he had proven just how remarkable he truly was. The officers finished securing the scene and assured Margaret that the attackers would face serious consequences for their actions. As the police cars drove away, lights still flashing, Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the ordeal begin to lift. Her quiet evening walk had turned into something far more dramatic than she could have imagined. Yet, standing there with Max by her side, she felt safer than ever. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she wouldn't face them alone, not with her loyal guardian watching over her. The days following the attack were a whirlwind for Margaret and Max. News of their harrowing encounter spread like wildfire, first through the neighborhood and then across the city. Local reporters arrived at Margaret's doorstep, eager to hear the full story of how an elderly woman and her dog had thwarted a violent crime. At first, Margaret was hesitant to share too much. She valued her privacy. But she soon realized that Max's bravery deserved recognition. This wasn't just about her. It was about honoring the bond they shared and shedding light on the incredible work of military canines. During interviews, Margaret recounted every detail with pride, though her voice softened whenever she spoke about Max. "He's not just my pet," she explained, her eyes glistening with emotion. "He's my hero, my protector, and my best friend." She went on to describe Max's background as a retired U.S. Army canine, explaining how he had served in dangerous missions overseas before coming into her life. The reporters listened intently, captivated by the tale of this unlikely duo, a quiet, silver-haired woman and the battle-hardened dog who had become her shadow. Word of Max's heroics reached veterans organizations and animal advocacy groups, sparking an outpouring of support. A local chapter of a veterans association decided to host a special ceremony to honor Max's service, both past and present. They invited Margaret and Max to attend, promising a heartfelt tribute that would celebrate his courage and dedication. Margaret accepted graciously, touched by the gesture. She knew Max might not fully understand the significance of such an event, but she also knew he would appreciate the love and admiration being showered upon him. On the day of the ceremony, Margaret dressed in her finest clothes, while Max wore a brand new collar adorned with an American flag patch. As they walked into the community center where the event was held, they were met with thunderous applause. Veterans, families, and even strangers lined the room, clapping and cheering for Max. Some attendees wiped away tears as Margaret took the stage to speak. Her words were simple yet powerful, filled with gratitude for the men and women who train military dogs and for the animals themselves, who serve selflessly without asking for anything in return. When it came time to present Max with a Medal of Valor, the audience erupted into cheers once more. The medal hung proudly around Max's neck, glinting under the lights as he stood tall beside Margaret. It was clear that Max felt the energy of the crowd. His tail wagged slowly, and his ears perked up as if he understood the weight of the moment. Margaret leaned down to whisper in his ear, "You deserve this, my brave boy." After the ceremony, Margaret was approached by several people who wanted to thank her, or rather, thank Max. One man introduced himself as a former handler of military working dogs. He knelt down to greet Max, his eyes misty with nostalgia. "I've worked with dogs like you," he said softly, scratching behind Max's ears. "You're one of the good ones." Others shared stories of their own experiences with service animals, creating a sense of camaraderie among everyone present. The attention didn't stop there. Social media lit up with posts about Max's heroism, and local news outlets ran segments highlighting his story. People from all over the country sent messages of support, calling Max a true hero. Even schools reached out, asking if Margaret and Max could visit to teach children about bravery, loyalty, and the importance of helping others. Margaret agreed to a few appearances, knowing it was a chance to inspire young minds. Through it all, Margaret remained humble. She insisted that Max was simply doing what came naturally to him, that protecting those he loved was ingrained in his very being. But deep down, she knew their story had resonated with so many because it was a testament to the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Max may have been trained for combat, but his greatest mission turned out to be guarding the heart of the woman who gave him a second chance at life. As the spotlight began to fade, Margaret reflected on everything that had happened. She felt immense gratitude, not only for Max, but for the community that had rallied around them. Life had thrown its challenges her way, but with Max by her side, she faced each one with courage. And now, thanks to his actions on that fateful night, countless lives have been touched by their story. For Margaret, it was proof that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through. And sometimes, that light came in the form of a four-legged guardian angel. The aftermath of the attack brought unexpected changes to Margaret's quiet life, but none of them were unwelcome. The outpouring of love and support from the community was overwhelming in the best possible way. Strangers stopped her during her daily walks to thank Max for his bravery, often bringing treats or small gifts as tokens of appreciation. Children would run up to pet him, their eyes wide with admiration, asking Margaret if Max really used to be a soldier. She always smiled and nodded, explaining that yes, he was, and that he still carried that same sense of duty today. But it wasn't just neighbors and acquaintances who reached out. Veterans groups across the country took notice of Max's story, sharing it within their networks and inviting Margaret to speak at events. One organization even sent a care package filled with dog toys, grooming supplies, and a personalized blanket embroidered with the words "Hero Dog." It was clear that Max had struck a chord with people. His story reminded them of the sacrifices made by military working dogs and the lasting impact these animals have on human lives. Margaret also received letters and emails from people whose lives had been touched by service dogs. Some wrote about their own experiences adopting retired military canines, while others shared stories of how working dogs had saved soldiers' lives overseas. One letter stood out to Margaret in particular. It came from a former handler who had worked alongside Max during his deployment years ago. The man explained how Max had once detected an improvised explosive device, i.e., hidden near a convoy, preventing what could have been a devastating tragedy. Max is a legend among handlers. The man wrote. We always knew he'd keep doing great things, no matter where life took him. The attention didn't stop at heartfelt messages. Local businesses began offering free services for Max. A grooming salon offered complimentary baths. A pet store provided food and treats, and a veterinarian promised annual checkups at no cost. Even the mayor of their small town issued a proclamation declaring a Max Day in honor of his heroism. Margaret chuckled when she heard about it, teasing Max gently. "Looks like you're officially famous now," she said, scratching behind his ears. Despite all the fanfare, Max remained unchanged. He continued to live his life with the same calm dignity that had always defined him. While Margaret basked in the glow of newfound friendships and connections, Max seemed content simply being by her side. His loyalty never wavered, nor did his protective instincts. If anything, the incident only strengthened their bond. Margaret noticed that Max stayed closer to her than ever before, as if determined to ensure nothing bad would happen again. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Margaret reflected on everything that had happened. She thought about the attackers, now facing justice, and how different that night might have ended without Max. She thought about the strangers who had rallied around them, offering kindness and support when she needed it most. And she thought about Max, the silent guardian who had risked everything to protect her. "You've given me so much more than safety," Margaret murmured, resting her hand on Max's head. "You've shown me what true courage looks like." Max tilted his head slightly, gazing up at her with those intelligent, soulful eyes. Then, as if understanding every word, he rested his chin on her knee and let out a soft sigh. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret realized something important. Max's heroism wasn't confined to that single night. Every day he walked beside her, every moment he watched over her, was a testament to his unwavering devotion. He may have left the battlefield behind, but he still carried the heart of a warrior, one that beat not for conflict, but for connection. For Margaret, there was no greater gift than knowing she had earned the trust and love of such an extraordinary companion. Though life had returned to its usual rhythm, Margaret knew things would never quite be the same, not because of fear, but because of gratitude. With Max by her side, she felt invincible. Together, they had faced danger and emerged stronger, their bond unshakable. And as long as Max was with her, Margaret knew she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they trot along quietly, wagging their tails, and reminding us that even in the darkest moments, we're never truly alone. Life after the attack settled into a new kind of normal for Margaret and Max, one that was quieter, but no less meaningful. The initial flurry of attention had died down, leaving behind a deep sense of gratitude, not just from Margaret, but from everyone who had heard their story. Neighbors continued to greet them warmly on their walks, often stopping to ask how Max was doing or share another tale of admiration. Children still waved excitedly when they saw him, calling out, "There's the hero dog." Max took it all in stride, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the fame. Margaret found herself reflecting more deeply on the lessons she'd learned through this experience. Before that fateful night, she had always appreciated Max's presence in her life, but now she understood just how profound his role truly was. He wasn't just a companion. He was a protector, a confidant, and a source of strength. His actions reminded her of something important. Bravery isn't about being fearless. It's about standing your ground even when fear tries to take over. And Max had done exactly that, not once wavering in his loyalty. One day, as Margaret flipped through a stack of letters she'd received, she came across one that made her pause. It was from a young girl named Lily, who wrote with childlike enthusiasm about how Max had inspired her to be brave too. "I used to be scared of everything," Lily confessed in her note. "But now I think if a dog can save someone, maybe I can help people too." Enclosed with the letter was a drawing of Max wearing his medal, surrounded by stars and hearts. Margaret smiled softly, feeling a lump rise in her throat. She realized then that Max's impact extended far beyond their little neighborhood. He had become a symbol of courage for strangers near and far. To honor that legacy, Margaret decided to use their story for good. With encouragement from veterans groups, she began volunteering at local schools and community centers, sharing Max's journey to inspire others. During these visits, she spoke not only about his military service, but also about the importance of kindness, resilience, and second chances. Max taught me that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, she would say, gesturing toward her loyal companion. Sometimes they're right beside us, waiting to show us what they're capable of. The children adored Max, crowding around him during these events to pet his soft fur and ask questions. "Did you really fight bad guys?" one boy asked eagerly, his eyes wide with wonder. Margaret chuckled and nodded. "He protected me when I needed him most," she replied. Another child tugged at her sleeve, asking if Max liked belly rubs. Laughing, Margaret assured them he did. And soon enough, Max found himself sprawled on the floor, happily accepting affection from his newfound fans. These moments filled Margaret with joy, but they also reinforced something she already knew. Max's purpose wasn't limited to his days in the military. Even in retirement, he continued to serve, this time by bringing people together and teaching them valuable lessons. His quiet strength reminded everyone that true heroism isn't loud or flashy. It's steady, reliable, and rooted in love. As autumn turned to winter, Margaret noticed subtle changes in Max. Though he remained as alert and protective as ever, there were times when he moved a bit slower, favoring one leg over the other. The injuries he'd sustained during his service occasionally acted up, a reminder of the sacrifices he'd made. But Margaret made sure he was comfortable, taking extra care to massage his joints and keep him warm on chilly nights. Despite his age catching up with him, Max's spirit remained undiminished. On their evening walks, he still trotted proudly beside Margaret, his tail wagging lazily as he soaked in the sights and smells of the world around them. Occasionally, someone would stop to thank him again. And though Max couldn't understand their words, Margaret swore she saw a flicker of pride in his eyes, as if he knew just how much he meant to so many. Margaret often thought about how lucky she was to have found Max, or perhaps how lucky he was to have found her. Their lives had intertwined in ways neither could have predicted, creating a bond that transcended words. Through every challenge, triumph, and quiet moment, they had stood side by side, proving that sometimes the greatest heroes are those who walk silently beside us, offering unwavering love and protection without expecting anything in return. And so, as snowflakes began to fall gently around them one evening, Margaret wrapped her scarf tighter and reached down to pat Max's head. "We've been through quite the adventure, haven't we?" she said softly. Max looked up at her, his breath forming tiny clouds in the cold air, and gave her hand a gentle nudge. In that moment, Margaret knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, as they always had. Life moved forward, but the memory of that fateful night lingered in Margaret's mind, not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of resilience. She refused to let the attack dictate how she lived her life. If anything, it had taught her the value of courage and the strength that comes from trust, in herself, in Max, and in the goodness of those around her. Every evening, they continued their walks through the neighborhood, just as they always had. Only now, there was an added sense of peace, knowing that no matter what happened, they would face it together. Max grew older, his once sleek coat graying at the edges, and his steps becoming slower with each passing year. But even in his twilight years, he carried himself with dignity, his sharp eyes still alert to every sound and movement. Margaret marveled at how much he seemed to understand without words. When she felt tired or overwhelmed, Max would nuzzle her hand gently, as if reminding her that she wasn't alone. His presence was a constant source of comfort, a quiet reassurance that love doesn't fade, even when time leaves its mark. As the seasons changed, so did their routine. Winters brought shorter walks, with Margaret bundling up in layers while Max trotted happily through the snow, his breath forming little clouds in the crisp air. Summers meant lazy afternoons on the porch, where Max would stretch out beside her, basking in the warmth of the sun. Neighbors often stopped by to chat, bringing treats for Max or simply sitting for a few moments to share stories. Margaret cherished these interactions, realizing how much closer she had grown to her community because of Max's heroism. One spring morning, Margaret received an invitation to attend a special event hosted by a national organization dedicated to honoring military working dogs. They wanted to recognize Max not only for his service overseas, but also for his bravery in protecting Margaret. Though hesitant to travel far from home, Margaret decided it was an opportunity too meaningful to pass up. Together, they boarded a plane for the first time, heading to Washington, D.C., where the ceremony would take place. The event was held in a grand hall filled with veterans, handlers, and families who had been touched by the work of military canines. As Margaret walked in with Max by her side, the room erupted into applause. Many attendees approached them afterward, sharing heartfelt stories about their own experiences with service dogs. One veteran knelt down to greet Max, tears streaming down his face. "Dogs like him saved my life," he said, shaking Margaret's hand. "Thank you for taking care of him." At the end of the evening, Max was presented with another medal, a Lifetime Achievement Award recognizing his unwavering dedication and service. Margaret proudly pinned it next to the others on his collar, feeling a swell of pride and gratitude. As they posed for photos, Max sat tall, his tail thumping softly against the floor. To everyone in the room, he was more than a dog. He was a symbol of loyalty, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Back home, life returned to its simple rhythm. Margaret and Max resumed their daily routines, finding joy in the small moments, watching birds flit across the yard, listening to the rustle of leaves in the wind, and sharing quiet companionship on cool evenings. Margaret knew their time together was precious, and she made sure to savor every second. She often whispered to Max, "You've given me so much more than I could ever repay." And though Max couldn't respond in words, his steady gaze and gentle nudges said everything she needed to hear. Years later, when Max finally passed away peacefully in his sleep, Margaret felt a profound ache in her heart. Yet even in grief, she found solace in the memories they had created together. She remembered the way he had stood between her and danger, fearless and determined. She thought about the countless lives he had touched, both during his military service and in their quiet corner of the world. Most of all, she remembered the bond they shared, one that transcended language and time. In honor of Max, Margaret became involved with organizations supporting retired military working dogs, advocating for their adoption and care. She spoke passionately about the importance of giving these heroes loving homes after their service ended. Her efforts inspired others to open their hearts to animals like Max, ensuring that their legacies would live on. Though Max was gone, his spirit remained alive in Margaret's actions and in the stories people continued to tell about him. He had proven that true heroism isn't defined by grand gestures. It's found in the quiet acts of devotion, the willingness to stand firm in